Yeah. Well, let's get started, and people will pop in as they can, so that we can end ahead of 1 o'clock. So I'm appreciative of everybody's lunchtime, and I'm really appreciative that Dr. Outcalt agreed to continue in our next great Sycamore read that Catherine, who is on this call, had kicked off for us. And this was an idea generated out of one of our parent coffees with the head of school, just looking for recommendations for great podcasts, great books. And yeah, we can kind of take a look at the world and see what our Amazon feeds give us. But what's really appreciated is getting to hear from our educators and our people, and to hear what they recommend and lead some conversation around it. So with that, I'm going to mute and give the microphone over to Samantha. Samantha, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So to those of you live and any who might be watching the recording, welcome. Glad to have you here. I am Samantha Outcalt. I'm the psychologist on staff at Sycamore, and I also have the pleasure of raising a few Sycamore kiddos myself. One is still here in middle school, and the other two are now in high school and college. I love this book. I really appreciate Becky Kennedy's approach. She is also a clinical psychologist. She has such a no-nonsense, but thoughtful and warm and inviting approach to parenting that makes a lot of sense to me. I can geek out over psychological theory all day long, but she also follows that up with a lot of really hands-on practical strategies that as a mom, I really appreciate. So I want to talk about the structure of our book discussion today. I'm going to give a summary of the parenting principles from her book. She divided her book up into about 40-60, where the first 40-ish% was kind of these general principles. And then the rest of her chapters were targeting specific areas and challenges. So after we wrap up the summary of the parenting principles, I will give you guys a choice of which of those challenge areas you would like to discuss together. So we'll have a little choose your own adventure moment. And then questions and comments are welcome throughout, but we will also reserve some time at the end for additional discussion, comments, questions, and all of that. So going to those parenting principles, she had a few overarching themes that really emerged throughout the book, even at the end in those specific chapters as well. But her main premise is that kids are good inside, and the title of the book. But not just kids, but we parents are also good inside, and it's really important to keep that explicitly at the center of our thought process, our decision making, and the actions that we're taking as we're parenting. She really reframes challenging moments with our kids as this is a good kid having a hard time, which helps us take that compassionate perspective. Another major theme of hers is this idea of behavior versus identity. What a kid does is not who they are, and it's really important to keep those separate. And lastly, but not least important, this might even be the most important, is that connection is key. Connecting with kids, that tie between that parent and child, the relationship is really critical to all of this work. So we'll dive into all three of these. First, she talks a lot about two things can be true. You don't have to choose between firm decisions and loving validation. You can offer both to your kids in the same moment. And not just that you can, but maybe that is the wisest choice, is to make sure that they are lovingly seen for who they are, as well as seeing that you are the sturdy decision maker. You are the parent with authority who is going to keep everyone safe. As she talks about seeing the good inside, I really love this notion of the MGI. She's a huge fan of acronyms. If you read the book and noticed, she has a lot of little acronyms here and there. I don't care so much about the acronym, but I love the philosophy of this most generous interpretation. That when something has happened, when there's been a blow up or a meltdown or an argument or a kiddo has refused to do something, it can really help the moment if, as a parent, we take on that most generous interpretation. We ask ourselves, what is my most generous interpretation of what just happened? What is going on for my child internally? It helps us think about their thoughts, their feelings, their urges, their impulses, all of the things inside of the child that we can't see. Um, it also, by offering this most generous interpretation, helps our kids develop that internal orientation so that they are becoming more aware of their thoughts, feelings, urges, impulses, et cetera, et cetera. And when they are developing the self awareness, it leads to self regulation. We can't have the self regulation without the self awareness, and the MGI helps us build all of that. Again, coming back to that idea of two things are true. Our kid is good inside and having a hard time. She talks a lot about that good kid having a hard time notion, and that both of these are true in the same moment. I kind of like how she talks about job descriptions. The parent's job is to keep the child safe. That means physically safe, emotionally safe. And the way that we do that is by holding boundaries. And then the child's job is to experience and express a wide range of emotions. So when we see a 2-year-old throwing a 2-year-old tantrum or a 12-year-old throwing a 12-year-old style tantrum, we can say to ourselves, they are doing a fantastic job being a 2-year-old or being a 12-year-old. And we can also hold that two things are true, where my kid is very good inside and having a hard time. We can hold the two things are true of, back to this, you can have firm decisions and loving validation in the midst of that hard moment. I thought this was an important quote. Kids' ability to regulate feelings depends on our willingness to acknowledge, validate, and permit those feelings. Now, this caveat at the bottom is also important, and to put up boundaries when the feelings spill into dangerous actions. So I like that she mentioned we can't just be empathic and compassionate and allow all of the things. We are not advocating for being permissive parents. We want to hold that authority and give the love at the same time. But this importance on acknowledging, validating, and permitting the feelings is what helps kids build the self awareness, which then leads to the self regulation as well. Her concept of behavior versus identity, I think, is very important. And for some of us, kind of rattles our worldview of how we were raised and how we saw the world growing up. But this idea that you are not your behavior, you are not your worst mistake. There's so much more to you than this hard moment. And she talks about this for kids and for adults, that we can recognize this for ourselves as well as recognize this in our kids. But behavior is just a window into the child's internal state. The behavior that we see is a clue to what they need. And if we think of it as what something we can get curious about, we can investigate. What is this behavior telling me? It's expressing some kind of unmet need. How can I address it? Instead of it being a moral referendum on who they are as a person. This idea that behavior is just the tip of the iceberg, and under the surface of the water is the internal state of the child. If we are intervening on the surface level, we are just putting band-aids on the issue, and it will continue to happen again and again and again. But if we can address the feelings, the needs, the safety of the child, then we can establish some longer lasting change. So here's an infographic that I love. There are lots of these out there, um, but that give us just a visual of that iceberg. What we see is the behavior above the surface of the water. What we don't see is the need to belong, maybe some executive function skill lag, maybe some self esteem that's lower than that isn't impacting the moment. They might be struggling with some attention issues. There might be some basic needs like hunger, sleep, and other physical needs as well that are driving all of the behavior. And again, if we only intervene at the surface, we're not getting to what's underneath. She talked a lot about building resilience, and distress tolerance is key to building resilience. I love how she gets us off of the hook of having to fix our kids' feelings. Because, first of all, how plausible is that really? But also, it's not good for them. It's not good for them for us to swoop in and help them escape a distressing situation. Instead, we sit with them until they get to the other side. And that helps them learn to cope. That helps them learn that although this is an uncomfortable feeling, I can tolerate it, I can cope with it, and I can get to the other side. I love her analogy of the sturdy pilot. And I've heard her talk in interviews about this before, where she expands on it a little more than she did in the book. Where, if the pilot is flying and says, "Oh no, we've hit this problem, and we're going to have to turn around and return to our uh, where we left from instead of going all the way to our destination." And there's a passenger in the back that gets irate and says, "No, no, 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 no. I have to get to my meeting in Chicago. You have to get me there. You have to power us through." And then the pilot says, "Oh, well, I guess this mechanical failure is not such a big issue. This guy needs to get to Chicago. I'll take him to Chicago." When we hear a pilot change his mind like that, or if the pilot is unsure, or if the pilot is just not firm and taking that authority, then all of us on the plane would feel very unsafe. And this is true in parenting as well. The pilot does not let the passengers take control. The parents do not let the kids take control. But what's different in parenting is that we are tuning into the kids' needs. We are hearing from them. We are validating their emotional experience, and we're allowing them to sit with that discomfort. So she makes this point multiple times. It is not the feeling itself that feels bad. It is the aloneness in that feeling. And for kids in particular who are developmentally appropriately not yet well advanced in their emotional awareness or emotion regulation, the feelings can be scary. How long will this feeling sit with me? How big will it get? Will I feel this thing forever? And so, on top of the initial distress, there can be layers of fear and worry and embarrassment. Um, and so, when we can be there with our kids and show up with them, sit in the feeling with them, then that reduces those extra layers.
I just have to comment before you go into the slide. I can hear middle school coming down the hallway, both through your microphone and now through my microphone. That was a fun little. They are heading back from the middle school meeting.
A joyful noise for sure. So connection is key. The relationship between parent and child establishes the template for who they are, how they deal with hard times, their future relationships. It is the foundation for everything. And so she really brings the point home that connection is critical. And so anytime there is going to be some discipline or some redirection or conversation about a hard moment, there needs to be connection before correction. And she talks about how connection is the antidote to shame. And I really love her, the way that she delineates guilt from shame. I think that that portion of the book was really worthwhile for us to think about. Guilt is what we feel when we've done something we regret or aren't happy about, aren't proud of, whereas shame is more a sense of, I feel bad about who I am. And we don't want kids to feel shame. Shame can lead to all kinds of other toxic, negative consequences, and guilt can be very appropriate when an action has been taken that should not have been taken. But shame, not so much. And so connection is that antidote to shame. And I think it's really important to point out, validating an emotion does not mean approving of a behavior. It is really critical to be explicit about that with our kids too, that I see you are having a hard time. I understand feeling frustrated when you don't get what you want. And I'm not okay with you taking that thing from your sibling. Again, going back to that two things are true notion. She also talks about building connection capital, which is really the fun part of parenting. This is like the best parts of parenting that we get to enjoy. Being silly with your kids, having one-on-one connection time with your kids, um, meeting them where they are, which sometimes isn't always the most fun, to be honest, if you are not into the thing that they are doing, but you're joining them on their turf instead of yours, that means so much to them. And then the importance of repair. We mess up as parents. We all do. And we will continue to mess up as parents. Those mistakes are inevitable. And there will be times when we use a harsher tone or we make a decision for a child or about a situation involving our child that we could have done a little better with. But then we can come back and repair. She makes the point that it is not just apologizing, but also finding out what the child needs and really taking ownership for what it is that we wish we had done differently. And then making a plan. If a situation like this does happen again, here's what I will do then. I like this quote: healthy relationships are defined not by a lack of rupture, but by how well we repair. And I think that takes some of the pressure off. We don't have to be the perfect parent. We don't have to avoid conflict and avoid rupture. We don't want to seek it out, maybe, but it is going to happen. And we allow when it happens, and then we repair. Okay, before I go into choose your own adventure, let me pause there and see what comments, questions, or discussion you might like to have about that first portion of the book where she's talking about parenting principles. Feel free to unmute yourself and just speak aloud, or if you'd prefer to put a question or comment in the chat, that is okay too.
With the silence, I'll jump in only to say that one of the lines that caught me, which it was in one of the early chapters, I think there was sort of the breaking the cycle of just addressing the behaviors as opposed to getting at the actual connection and it reminded me of the time when my youngest son was going through speech and language therapy, and I was learning his language, and I realized, oh right, I'm a part of this too. I have to actually I have homework in this, which is less fun because it's more fun to give our children homework than for us to have to do it. But I think these were I got a sense from her of the important reminders of our work in this, to establish these healthy cycles, as opposed to sort of like child does X, address X in such and so a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. It makes me think about the how much she brings up curiosity, and that when we can get curious about what just happened and find out where our child is with it. What are their thoughts? What was their reaction? How are they handling the moment? Instead of imposing our interpretation of it onto them, I think it was really helpful. So I appreciated that curiosity piece. There's a section, for those of you who have the book in front of you, there's a section on page 81 where she talks about kind of some steps for engaging in that most generous interpretation. And it really is with being curious. It begins with being curious. So, what is my most generous interpretation? What was going on for my child in that moment? What was my child feeling right before the behavior emerged? What urge did my child have a hard time regulating? What is a parallel situation in my life? And it goes on. And I think that when she presents these really tangible strategies of how we can guide ourselves through a moment, it's very helpful.
Can you guys hear me? I'm like connected to my AirPods. Okay, perfect. Jenna Striker here. Yeah, I love the MGI. We use that in our house, like with adult conversations too. You know, when you're thinking about something hard at work or something, and sometimes we kind of say to each other, well, let's give it the MGI. And so I think, you know, it goes forward and farther than just like with our children. So I love that section.
Yes, thank you for bringing that forward. I think you're so right that in adult relationships too, it can be really helpful. Well, anyone else, please feel free to pop in with a comment or question. I'm also going to move forward to this slide where we can choose our own adventure. So her last several chapters went chapter by chapter talking about a particular topic or challenge in parenting. And so I thought I would give you guys a chance to select what feels most important to you. So again, feel free to unmute or you can type in the chat where you would like to go. And I have a few in mind. If we don't get any suggestions, I can guide us through a few, but I would love to hear your priorities. So I'm seeing emotional tantrums, sibling rivalry. Absolutely. What else feels important?
I'll put in my 2 cents for lying, because I think that's such a hot button one.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I saw whining come through.
Yes. And deeply feeling kids. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's start with emotional tantrums. So she talks about emotional tantrums as really a state of dysregulation and how important that framing can be. That in the moment, it can really feel like a willful act of disobedience. It can feel like our kids simply putting forth a power struggle. And when we can recognize that a tantrum is a sign of something underneath, it is a sign of this dysregulation and the child not having the skills to manage all of those feelings, it can shift our frame a bit. It doesn't mean it makes it easy. It doesn't mean that we suddenly know what to do, but it is a very good starting point. Recognizing a tantrum for what it is on the inside. What is this? What is the behavior giving us a clue into, rather than what's happening on the outside? So maybe during the tantrum, the child is yelling words that feel hurtful, or might even toss a shoe across the room. And it is important to understand that those behaviors are outward examples of what's happening on the inside. And so during an emotional tantrum, the goal is really help the child build the emotion regulation skills. And what's not the goal, might sound really counterintuitive, is to end the tantrum. The main goal is not to end it, not to get them to end it, but it's simply to help build emotion regulation and to ride it out, really, without it becoming worse, ideally. And so the strategies are connecting with your child. That moment of emotion dysregulation is a sign that the child needs more connection. Showing them that you understand how big this feels, what's happening for them internally. Now, again, you may not agree with it. You may not agree that the wrong shape of pasta is something to get angry about, but you've been angry before. You can see that they're angry and you can connect with their anger. And the other part is helping them hold on to their internal goodness. So even though this big tantrum is happening, they are a good kid inside. You are a good parent inside, and keeping that at the forefront. So the strategies she talks about are remind yourself of your own goodness, starting there. and remembering that two things can be true. That I am in charge of this decision. My answer is no, we're not making a whole separate dinner. You are in charge of your feelings and you're allowed to be upset about them, about the situation. I really liked these 3 points that she mentions in that chapter. We are not in charge of our children's feelings. Our kids don't need to say, sure, no problem, when we make a decision. We don't necessarily need them to agree with our decision. And communicating that we are okay with their feelings teaches them that it's okay to have these big feelings, which is important to emotion regulation. It does not mean you're going to see emotion regulation right then and there. We have to keep our mind on the long game and the long-term outcomes rather than that immediate moment. I love her strategy of name the wish, of saying, you wish you had a later bedtime, or you wish you could have ice cream for breakfast. I know, I hear that. When you name the wish, they feel seen. And that goes a really long way in helping them develop that internal understanding of themselves. I also like to validate the magnitude. I think I don't necessarily execute this in the same way that she does, but these are all customizable, that you can help the child understand the intensity of their feeling. And saying, I personally in my family and with kids I work with here at Sycamore, I think it's really helpful to use a number scale. On a scale of 0 to 10, and this varies by age though, of course, on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is not feeling frustrated at all, and 10 is the most frustrated any human being could ever feel, how frustrated are you feeling right now? And for some kids, I'm even clear about there is no 11, there's no 12, 10 is the highest, because gifted kids will try to push that a little bit. But validate the magnitude, help them understand this is a big feeling. I'm feeling a lot of it. Questions or comments about emotional tantrums?
I think for kids in a seriously emotionally dysregulated state, that actually works even, into the middle grades. I think there's some students that really just need the simplicity of a number scale, to be able to define it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you can get creative with that too. Some kids might have other ways of describing their feelings that works better for them. Becky Kennedy in here talks about it as, it's as big as the house or it's as big as the world. Some kids might want to describe it with different gradations of a color or even an animal to represent it. Eventually, we do want to build an emotional vocabulary, emotional literacy for naming the feeling. That's not work we're going to do in the middle of a tantrum, though.
And do you recommend like the scale because you find that helps switch them out of is that the thought that it helps like kind of switch their attention?
Oftentimes, yes. And it really depends on your kiddo. I would recommend introducing the scale before a tantrum or during a time when we're not in the middle of a tantrum so that they have a little familiarity and practice with it. And then in the middle of a tantrum, you could say something like, I see you're feeling something pretty big. I don't know how big it is. Do you know? What number would you give it? And then they know what you're talking about because you've already had those discussions. All right, let's talk about sibling rivalry. So she introduced this chapter with a very interesting parallel adult situation. She suggested that we think about if all of a sudden your family was going to get a new spouse and you had to adapt to having a new spouse in your family, and that wasn't something that you ever asked for or wanted. And so that was an interesting parallel to think about.
Yeah, that got spicy for a second. Where are we going with it?
Yeah, it did. It did a little bit. But so I think it was helpful, though, to really imagine what it's like to be an older child with new kids coming into the family. She didn't go so much into the experience of being the younger child with older siblings. I don't know if she's an oldest child herself, and so her perspective might be a little skewed. I don't know. But I would have liked to see a little bit more discussion of that too. She nodded to it, but she talked about helping kids understand all of their feelings that arise in relation to their sibling. And us as adults, as parents, it's important for us to recognize, and we know this intellectually, but we need to remember it in the moments too, that siblings are not always going to be best friends. They're not always going to like everything about each other. And there are a lot of ripe opportunities for annoyance, irritation, and frustration. And so helping kids navigate sibling rivalry or even just a hard moment with a sibling has a lot to do with regulating those feelings and tolerating those feelings, allowing those feelings. Now, again, we can validate an emotion without approving of a behavior. So we can say, I understand that you are feeling frustrated, you are feeling jealous, you are feeling angry, and I won't let you hit your brother. She talks about some strategies. She has this PNP time. She loves her acronyms, which means play no phone in her lingo. I am such a fan of screen-free one-on-one time with kids. It can be a solution to a lot of problems. Spending one-on-one time, even if it's just 30 minutes, can go a really long way in helping a child feel connected with their parent, which also then leads to all of the other things we want. We want that emotional awareness, emotion regulation. And so when they have that connection time with a parent, it builds that foundation. I liked her idea about we don't do fair, we do individual needs. I think that is so important. You know, at Sycamore, educationally, we are differentiating to each student in an academic sense. I think that this applies to parenting as well. You meet each child's needs where they are. And sometimes that means that different kids are getting different things. But it needs to mean that because kids need different things at different times. She talks about allowing venting, but only to you. So being very clear, you are not going to go to your sister and tell her all of the things you don't like about her. But you can come to me and tell me how frustrated you are. You can tell me how annoyed you are. You can tell me how threatened it feels for X, Y, and Z to happen. But then being very clear, you know, my job as a parent is to keep everyone in this family safe. And that safety includes the words we use with each other. So even as you're talking to me, we're not going to talk about how terrible your sister is. She talks about step in when there's danger, but not when there's not. And I think that's really important. When there's not danger, instead of stepping in, we slow it down and narrate the situation. And so we give a bit of adult scaffolding to the situation. We add a frontal lobe to the room because we know that the kids' frontal lobes aren't fully developed yet, and help explain that, you know, here's a situation that's happening. Let me see if one of her examples might be worth sharing. She talks about the role when it's not a dangerous situation is to slow things down but not solve. So you model your own regulation without forcing regulation on them. And then you can say something like, two kids, one truck. That is so tricky. I wonder what we can do. I wonder if we have any problem solvers here. And that invites them in without putting that pressure that they need to solve it, but kind of invites them into that problem solving mode. What questions do we have, or comments or thoughts about sibling rivalry?
I know in some of the I'm just curious like how these are applied in the classroom. That example seems like so perfect where it's just classmates and peers too, not even just siblings at home. Especially because I know well, I've got two little girls and they're very close with the other girls in their class, which is fantastic. But they also kind of bicker like siblings sometimes too, right? And they've got those dynamics at play. So I was just curious how these are implemented in the classroom so we can be consistent in both places to help them develop those skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the we don't do fair, we do individual needs is for sure something that is a part of all day, every day in classrooms across the school. Um, differentiating not just academically but also socially and emotionally. I think it is really important that teachers are seeing kids for who they are and where they are and meeting them at that spot. And I think that that happens um, pretty well. I think that some of these are maybe more home environment strategies like the PNP time, although having a quick one-on-one check-in with a teacher can go a long way for a student as well. And there might not be a 30-minute check-in with a teacher, but a quick 1 to 5 minute conversation could go a really long way for a student. Remembering that this dysregulation that happens and manifests as competition with other kids is coming from a need for connection helps us understand where to go with it. And so, whether it's at home or in the classroom, offering more connection from adults and facilitating at school, what can happen is facilitating opportunities for there to be that connection among peers as well. I think those are some strategies that can really help build up the connection, which reduces the need for seeking out that the dysregulated kinds of ways of looking for attention or connection. Other thoughts about that? I'm
While
going
you
to.
were talking,
Yeah,
while
go
you were
ahead.
talking, apparently she has two siblings, but I couldn't tell where she was on the birth order scale, so
Okay.
couldn't find it.
Thank you for that intel. I am going to jump to, pardon the bell ringing above me. I'm going to jump to deeply feeling kids, and then if we have time, we'll come back to whining. I know that we have a lot of deeply feeling kids here at Sycamore, so I think this is a relevant topic for many of us on the call and perhaps watching the recording too. Becky Kennedy talks about how closely shame and vulnerability can sit next to each other. And sometimes when we are inviting a deeply feeling kid to share what they're feeling, um, they feel too seen. They feel too vulnerable and they fear that they are not a good kid inside. And so, if they share any glimpse of their internal experience, you will see that. You will see that they're not a good kid because that shame is just living so close beneath the surface. Um, these It's also common for this type of kiddo to feel managed if there is a suggestion to take some deep breaths or a suggestion to let's go for a walk and take a break. Sometimes our tried and true strategies that work with most kids aren't as effective with a deeply feeling kid because they feel so managed, which then makes them feel seen, which then stirs up that shame of I must be a bad kid and they can see that. And so they have these deep fears about being unlovable, not being a good kid. And so a really important strategy that she starts with is moving from blame to curiosity and really making sure that we are getting to know their internal experience, even though they're not wanting to share that. And also looking inward with how we are viewing a situation. We can be, as adults, we can kind of default into either blaming ourselves or blaming the kid for the moment that just happened. But instead, setting that blame aside and just asking, well, what did happen? And getting really curious. She talks about containment. She also talked about this with the aggressive tantrums, that when there is a safety issue, it is important to step in and contain. And your child needs to see that happen. They need to know that you are not overpowered by their dysregulation. You are the sturdy parent. You are the sturdy pilot. You will get us through this. And that their feelings might be scary to them, but their feelings are not scary to you. And so you can contain the moment, Also keeping in mind, front and center, that this is a good kid having a hard time. And she talks about even explicitly telling yourself, this is a child who is in pain. This is a child who is in fear. And that can soften us. That can kind of lower the blame that we might be putting on ourselves. It can bring us into a place of compassion. Her suggestion to be present and wait it out is not easy. It is a really hard thing to stay in a moment. We talked a few slides ago about distress tolerance. That means tolerating our own distress as well as tolerating our kids' distress. But when you sit there with them, she says, nothing is as powerful as your presence. And that is absolutely true. That is such an impactful intervention, is just to be there and to witness that with them and to be available. She talks about, there might be some times where you do have to step out and take a break for yourself. And she talks about how to do that. The key elements of taking a break like that are explaining to your kid that you need to calm your body. So you're still providing a template for self-regulation as you're explaining that you need a break. Eliminating blame and, saying, I need to give my body space for deep breaths. I'm stepping outside the door. I'll be right back. So also like very clearly stating that this is not about them in this moment, but you're taking care of yourself and you'll be right back. I also liked her strategy, and I do this with kids all the time, is to come up with some other communication method of emotions if emotions are feeling too big, too heavy, or too vulnerable. And so her suggestion was the thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumb to the side. And she even said, the kiddo might have eyes closed or hiding under the bed, but they still stick the thumb out and they give you a response to what's going on with them. And she suggested starting this out with something kind of ridiculous or silly so that they're practicing the thumb movement on something that isn't quite so consequential. And then you can gradually build into the conversation of how they're actually doing. But an important piece of this is that you are slowly building their tolerance for feelings, their tolerance for vulnerability, and their tolerance for connection. Questions or comments about deeply feeling kids? And Grafton, thank you for your comment about problem solving between siblings. It is so true. And I'm glad that that's been helpful for you guys and also confirmed from the book. Thoughts about deeply feeling kids, or even any kiddo who is in a moment of feeling deeply and not wanting to share where they're coming from. Yes, there's a comment here. Adults taking time to self-regulate, such as putting ourselves in timeout, is an important reminder. I agree with that 100%. So let's shift to whining. She says a lot of times we interpret whining as a lack of gratitude. And so when we frame it that way, we can take it pretty personally. Or we might see it as a sign of disrespect, or we might have other interpretations that are not exactly our most generous interpretation. But she talks about this combination of wanting something and being helpless in that moment. And that's not only hard for kids, that is hard for adults too. And so if we can recognize what's underneath, remember we're looking under the surface for the rest of that iceberg, that combination of wanting and helplessness is just an awful combination. This is another moment where kids are seeking connection and need that moment with a trusted adult. And I like how she says this does not mean you have to give in to your kids' ridiculous demands, but the more you focus on the feelings underneath the surface, give them the connection they need, the less your children will whine. She also talks about another reason that kids whine, which is that they're looking for an emotional release. And whining is a sign that everything feels like too much. And so this can be a conversation, or this can be a moment where we recognize we need to do some skill building here. And so in the moment of whining is not the time for building skills, but it's a flag for us to notice that, okay, later on, I need to go back to this. And we need to explore some other ways of expressing the emotion that the kiddo is feeling. And this is going to vary from child to child. Some kids feel great by expressing themselves artistically. Other kids need a physical gross motor release. Other kids need to just snuggle and get comfy with the family dog or some blankies or stuffed animals. There are a lot of different ways that kids can express their emotions or meet those emotional needs. And whining can be one of the options, although probably not preferred by parents. But if they have other tools that are more effective at communicating what they need, that's going to be more helpful. She talks about channeling your own inner whiner, which is an interesting strategy that you embrace the whining yourself. But then you then take on some self-regulation and you model that in the moment, saying, okay, just a moment, I need a breath. I am safe, I can get through this. Also using humor. I think this is a fantastic strategy in a lot of different situations, to be playful. Now, she does make the point, playfulness is not mockery. And one thing that we have learned about gifted kids is sarcasm is not usually fun for very long. It can be fun for a little bit, but then all of a sudden it's not, and it's hurtful. And as adults, we don't always see the turning point. Sometimes peers also don't always see the turning point when another peer is just done with the sarcasm. But being playful about the situation and finding a way to have fun and bring in some humor and play into the moment. The strategy she has listed that I see the most value in is restating the request in your own voice and moving on. And so there is the whining that is maybe not an appropriate tone, but then we rephrase that and say, instead of saying, Dad, I need my book, you can then say to the child, I need you to say that again in a stronger voice, like, Dad, could you please get me the book? Thank you so much. And so you are modeling, you are giving the appropriate response and showing them how they could do it differently. Lastly, she talks about seeing the need, that when kids are whining, they're asking for more attention, more connection, more warmth, more empathy, more validation. So that's another one of those signals to have some one-on-one screen-free connection time and to validate what they're feeling. Questions or comments about whining? Well, let's think broadly about the book. What questions do you have overall, or any additional points that you'd like to discuss? And whether you choose to share it or not, I'd like for everyone, and I will do this myself as well, to think about one takeaway. You can have more than one if you want, but at least one takeaway from the book that you would like to implement at home. Even better if you can implement it within the next week. So all of these are up for discussion. Questions that you have, points you'd like to discuss, or if you'd like to share your takeaway.
I think so much of this feels like a call for empathy, with all the different scenarios and all the different structures, it is about the metaphor that you already gave about the iceberg and what lies beneath the surface, and trying to get at the root of it, as opposed to the reaction, the visible face of the child's frustration or anger or concern.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for me, a lot is like just trying to remember. I mean, it's the title of the book, right? Good Inside, but like we automatically go to future errors. Like my kid's never going to like figure this out, or they're, it's always going to be this way. And just recognizing that this is like one moment, and not blowing it up in our own minds and letting those thoughts unravel, I think is a lot. Just pausing, I think, to recognize where they're coming from. So I think that's my like takeaway going for this week, is just remembering when I don't like a behavior or something, just trying to pause and not spiral myself into error.
That's so important. Thank you for sharing those insights.
I think for me, reflecting on the kids' concern and just reassuring them that they are heard was like the most important takeaway. It's a lot of times we just don't reassure them that we are hearing them. We are hearing their concerns. So just reflecting on their concern is very important. And we have to keep in mind that this doesn't do miracles. It's not going to solve the problem right away, but at least you can just create that connection for a better, a future.
So true. Yes, a very good reminder that this is not a magic wand, and implementing all of these things will not solve or prevent everything. But that's not even the goal, because we want kids developing agency and ability to regulate their own emotions and behavior and decisions. And so the more that we put them in the driver's seat by listening and validating and connecting with them, then they'll develop those skills. Who else would like to share? We have a comment in the chat. It is exciting for this generation of parents to be studying and implementing these techniques, resources the past generations did not have much access to, if any. Absolutely. Very true. I'll share one takeaway for me. My kids are 12, 15, and 19, so I don't have the little kid struggles that we used to have. And I do work pretty effortfully at that one-on-one time, but just keeping in mind the importance of that. Especially, a 15-year-old doesn't always show you that they want that one-on-one adult time with parents, but I know it's still appreciated and still goes a long way.
I think we're about to wrap out of time. I want to thank you, Dr. Outcalt, for leading this conversation and encouraging us to read a really good book, and one that hopefully, if people didn't get to join in, we'll pass around our own copies and encourage them to get copies themselves and to be able to connect with Samantha for takeaways after today's conversation. So thank you for leading the discussion.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to have you all together.
Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Stay dry.
Give us more resources. This was great. Thank you.